Once there was a village that was at the foot of the mountains, specifically where the mountains met the desert. This village had received word of a terrible army that arrived from the sea. They were strong enough and fierce enough to completely destroy any village, town, or city that they came across. But every time before these sea people arrived, there would be an emissary that arrived. The emissary would give them an ultimatum every time. Submit to the sea people, or in 3 days the entire village would be destroyed by the sea people. And every time, the emissary kept his word. Now, this emissary came to this border village and spoke to the old mayor of the town. While the emissary spoke to the mayor, the entire village watched but refused to interfere. The emissary was a tall and pale man. He had no hair and carried a dark cloak. His only bright color was a bright sea blue jeweled brooch around his neck. He gave his terms to the mayor. Your village will pay an annual tribute to the sea people, equivalent to 30 ores. 1/10 of your village will serve as the sea people's helots, and another 10th of your village will be executed as a reminder of the power that the sea people have over you. In exchange, your village stands, and the other 8/10 of your village live, the emissary explained. The mayor did not want to agree with this. The village was barely worth 30 ores during a good year, but with hundreds of the villagers serving the sea people and hundreds more dead, there was no way he could manage such an expensive tribute. But still, 8/10 of a living village would be a lot more than no living village. And at least there would still be a village left to owe to the sea people. The mayor lifted his right hand, only for his hand to be lopped off by the old hunter of the village. The mayor clutched his stump to his chest, while the hunter slammed his hands down to the table. There is no deal, the hunter said. Here is our deal from our village to you. Leave us alone, or all of the sea people will die, the hunter told the emissary. The emissary caressed his brooch. My army numbers into the hundreds of millions. Laconia, Scythia, Kemet, and even the Middle Kingdom all fell to me. Their soldiers strangled with their own entrails. Their royalty enslaved to build my palaces. Their temples burned to the ground. The very gods dare not breathe in their own land, for they fear my vengeance. Do you expect your little village of maybe a few thousand to defeat my army of 100 million? No, I don't expect my village to do that. I expect myself to destroy your entire army. Not defeat it, destroy it. To the hunter, there was a big difference. Now, the emissary felt something in that moment. Something he hadn't for a long time. Fear. The hunter's gaze had no doubt, only resolution. But the emissary was still certain. He had defeated proud heroes before. In the end, bones broke, divine or mortal, and resolution usually broke soon after. Do you have 100 million arrows? The emissary asked him. I have almost a dozen arrows, emissary. You expect to stop 100 million with a dozen arrows? I expect to kill your army with one arrow, and the other arrow is reserved for your throat. The hunter whispered these last words. The emissary stood and stepped away. He called back to the entire village. 3 days, and your village will not even be a mark on a map. The emissary called out as he traveled into the desert. The hunter went home and began to prepare. He sharpened his arrow and practiced his bow. His shot sharpened almost as much as his arrows. Still, though, as time went on, some of the villagers came to ask him what his plan was. First, the village blacksmith came, asking the hunter what his plan was. Do you have some giant arrow you're planning on firing at the army? She asked the hunter. The hunter shook his head as he sharpened the wooden points on his arrows. No, that would just slow me down. These arrows are normal, no bronze and no iron, he said, blowing off the wooden shavings from the arrow tip. This confused the blacksmith. No metal to harden the arrow? Normal armor would bounce wood off as simple as a berry thorn, and surely the sea people's armor was even harder. Are you certain? I have plenty of arrows with iron heads, or bronze if you prefer. I even have silver if you think that'll be useful, the blacksmith offered to the hunter. The hunter shook his head. No, thank you. If you wish to help me, blacksmith, then come the day of invasion, I ask that you stand next to me, the hunter offered. The blacksmith looked down at her hands. She was as terrified of the sea people as anyone else in the village. But when she saw the hunter's eyes and how he had no fear, she knew it would be best for her to help him fight them off. I will stand next to you on the third day, the blacksmith said. The hunter nodded and went back to his archery practice. The blacksmith went back to her shop and continued her work on her own armor and hammer. She figured if she was going to fight, she would fight harder than anyone else. On the second day, the apprentice of the mage came to visit the hunter. The apprentice dressed in a blue cloak and hid their face and figure from all. Their master, the mage, had long since left the village when the emissary first came, but the apprentice stayed behind. They were eager to learn, and they disbelieved their master when they were told it was an unwinnable battle. On the second day, they decided to see the hunter to see what the plans he had. On the second day, the hunter was reading through old journals, not tomes of great magic, just his own tales to remind him of his old exploits. It was here where the hunter was asked his plan again. Are your arrows magic? Do they contain a storm so great it would shake the mountains down to the foundation? Or maybe they contain a dragon so ferocious it would tear across the skies and burn all the sea people to ash, the apprentice asked. The hunter only chuckled as he continued reading. I'm afraid that my arrows are not enchanted at all. No magic and no trickery. I don't know any magic to enchant them, even if I wanted to. This mystified the apprentice. No magic at all? They had no idea how a normal hunter would stop an army that Scythian horses and Laconian spears couldn't stop. If you want some magic, I can enchant your arrows. I'm not very strong at magic yet, but maybe I can help, the apprentice offered. The hunter looked up from his journal, impressed by the offer of the apprentice. If you want to help us tomorrow, then stand by my side while we face the army. The apprentice was confused. They were unsure what they could offer in the fight. Their magic and knowledge was weak in comparison to their master, but still they promised to be there the next day. On the dawn of the third day, the hunter, the apprentice, and the blacksmith stood on the field of battle. The emissary stood across from the hunter. Behind the emissary stood his entire army. The men had no eyes and no mouths, but still terrible screams could be heard from the dark soldiers even as they stood still. Even the horses were armored and breathed flame from their nostrils. The cavalry merged with their mounts, and the difference between beast and man didn't exist in the emissary's army. The emissary stood at the front of this terrible procession, but the blacksmith and the apprentice shook in fear, but still they stood. The hunter did not shake, for in the hunter's mind, the battle was already won. Well, great hunter, by all means, slay my army with a single arrow, the emissary said, throwing out his arms, gesturing to the legion of demons behind him. You said it would take only 2 arrows, so tell me, now that you face your death, what are you going to do against the nightmare of all nations? The emissary yelled out to the hunter. The hunter called out in response, I will loose 2 arrows, and then I will go home, the hunter stated. The emissary in anger yelled his battle cry, and the army behind him rushed forward. The blacksmith lifted her hammer, and the apprentice lifted their staff, both prepared to fight, both prepared to lose. The hunter loosed a single arrow from his bow. The wooden arrow flew straight and true from the hunter's practice on the first day. Iron or bronze or even bone would have made it too heavy for it to do its job for such a distance and such a small target. The arrow tore away the blue brooch from the emissary's throat, just like in the stories that the hunter spent the second day studying, learning of magical artifacts that could summon armies. With the brooch torn away from the emissary, the army dissolved into shadow and vanished long before they reached the hunter, the apprentice, or the blacksmith. The emissary, now standing before 3 armed enemies with no army, turned and ran from the hunter. Trying to reach his brooch? Trying to escape? Or maybe just trying to find some new weapon? We truly do not know. What we do know is the next arrow fired by the hunter struck the fleeing emissary in the foot. Now unable to flee the 3, they approached him, the emissary who now whimpered up at them. "Let me go. Let me collect my brooch. I will leave your village alone," the emissary promised. The hunter lifted his knife. "Let me go. Let me collect my brooch. We will pay tribute to you. I will pay any amount of gold if you just let me go," the emissary pleaded. The blacksmith lifted her hammer. "Let me go. Let me collect my brooch. I will offer you all the wisdom of the sea people. Any magic, any spell, any gift, all of it, if you just let me flee," the emissary begged. The apprentice struck her staff on the ground. "I will give your entire village, my entire empire, if that's what they desire. If only you let me live," the emissary yelped, covering his face, waiting for the strike to come. But no blow was struck. "You will oblige that request," the hunter said, using his blade to cut out the arrow. "I didn't want my arrow lost," the hunter said. The emissary breathed in relief only for a moment before the blacksmith shattered both his legs with her hammer. While the emissary screamed, the apprentice used their staff to carry the brooch, to keep it somewhere safe. They marched the emissary back to the village, having him crawl on broken legs and covered in mud, turning his once princely clothes into something even the poorest peasant wouldn't want to wear. When marched into the village square, the blacksmith made an iron collar, and the apprentice enchanted it, forcing the emissary to wear it while in the village, so he could never leave. To this very day, the emissary's body sits in the village square, a bowl in front of his body, begging even after death, but though no one was willing to give to him, in life or in death. He still waits, just for 2 centi, so that his soul can move on into the afterlife. But still, the villagers let the emissary's body and soul rot in the village square. The hunter admitted to the blacksmith and the apprentice that he was terrified when he saw the emissary's army. He knew from the first day how to break the spell, but on the 3rd day, seeing the problem before him, he had every thought in his head, telling them he couldn't possibly break the spell before he died. And when asked why he waited for the 3rd day, and why he simply didn't cut it away from the emissary's throat, he explained, "If you saw me cut the brooch away, all you would have seen is a hunter cut away a brooch. The emissary would have ordered a villager to give it back to him or risk his army's wrath. And there would be 10 villagers hopping over to do it, thinking they were helping to spare the village. But if everyone saw me stand before the army and dispel it just by tearing the brooch away, then they would have the bravery to refuse the emissary's words. The threat of an army is almost as terrifying as the army itself, but by facing it, we showed everyone that the army was less of a threat than our own fear." Our world is full of threats we consider impossible, But as long as we face them and believe no matter how terrifying the threat is that it can be resolved, then we can truly see it for what it is, the hunter told his friends. Thank you for listening to this hunter legend. It's an important one. It sets up the lore for the Hunters Guild and what's the importance of their knowledge, their training, and most importantly, their ability to work with others. Simply because even the most terrifying threats have a resolution. Thank you again for listening, and have a good rest of your night.